The red light blinked once, then again, as if the door itself was hesitating before rejecting me. It was just past 11:30 at night in Belltown, Seattle. The wind off Elliott Bay cut through my coat as I stood barefoot on the cold marble outside our penthouse, my heels dangling from 2 fingers. I pressed my thumb against the biometric lock a second time. Denied. I entered the 6-digit code Marcus and I had chosen the week we moved in, the numbers of the first account that ever crossed 1 million in my startup. The keypad flashed red again. My phone vibrated in my hand. Subject line: "The acquisition is finalized." I opened the email slowly, as if speed might soften the words. "You no longer have legal authority over the company or this residence." That was all. Behind me, the elevator chimed softly. The night concierge approached with careful steps, his face tight with discomfort. "MS. Hala," he said quietly. "We received updated ownership documentation this evening. Access permissions were changed at the request of the primary owner." Primary owner. The word settled into my chest like ice. In one night, my husband had sold my startup and erased me from my own home. And as the wind pressed against the glass wall overlooking the city I had built my life in, I realized something else. Marcus believed the deal was done. He believed I had no right to return, no leverage left, no authority to demand anything. He was wrong. I didn't argue with the concierge. I didn't cause a scene. Humiliation is loud inside your body but quiet on your face. I thanked him for letting me know and stepped back from the door. A neighbor down the hall cracked her door open, glanced at me, and quickly retreated. I imagined what this looked like: barefoot wife locked out after a fight. People prefer simple explanations. But this wasn't a fight. This was a takeover. I walked to the small sitting bench near the elevator and sat down, the marble cold against my skin. I scrolled back to Marcus's email and opened the attached PDF. Acquisition summary. Purchase agreement. Board approval minutes. The sale price made my stomach tighten. It was nearly 30% below the last internal valuation report I had reviewed 6 months earlier. That made no sense. Our fintech platform had just crossed a record milestone in active users, women over 55 managing retirement portfolios through the tools I designed after watching my aunt lose everything to predatory advisors. We were profitable, stable, growing conservatively but steadily. Undervaluing the company didn't just hurt me. It benefited someone. I scrolled to the signature page. Marcus Hale, Acting Executive Trustee. My name appeared nowhere. I stared at the words for a long time, letting the silence of the hallway press in around me. Acting Executive Trustee. 3 years earlier, I had transferred my controlling shares into a founder trust on the advice of a corporate attorney. At the time, it had felt overly cautious, almost paranoid. Marcus had laughed gently when I explained the structure. Symbolic protection, he had called it. But the trust was not symbolic. It required my written authorization for any change of control transaction. My signature. Not the board's, not the COO's. Mine. If he signed tonight without that authority, the deal was not clean. It was exposed. My phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Eleanor. You should have supported your husband. A family business requires loyalty. Family business. The words carried a quiet assumption that my company had already been absorbed into the Hale family legacy. I opened our shared banking dashboard out of instinct. A transfer had cleared that afternoon from Hale Family Holdings into an account tied to transaction fees. So this had not been impulsive. This had been planned. The penthouse door remained closed behind me, smooth and indifferent. Marcus was likely inside, confident that paperwork and proximity equaled control. He had changed the locks because he believed I would panic, that I would beg, that I would react emotionally and make mistakes. Instead, something inside me settled. I slipped my heels back on and stood. I considered calling him. I imagined his voice, calm, rational, explaining how this was for our future, how I was too sentimental about the startup I had built before he ever walked into my office. I didn't call. I scrolled past his name in my contacts. Further down was another name I had not dialed in months. Daniel Whitaker, corporate counsel. 3 years ago, after I noticed Marcus blending personal investment conversations with company forecasts. Daniel had leaned across a polished oak desk and said something that stayed with me. Control isn't what you announce. He told me. It's what you preserve quietly. At the time, I thought I was protecting the company from market volatility. Now I understood I had been protecting it from something closer. I pressed call. As the line began to ring, I took one last look at the door that no longer recognized my fingerprint. Marcus believed he had erased me tonight with a contract, a board vote, and a new access code. He forgot one detail. The only signature that could truly transfer my company was still mine. I did not go back to the Penthouse the next morning. Instead, I woke up in a quiet boutique hotel near Pike Place Market. The kind with exposed brick walls and expensive coffee I barely touched. Seattle was gray outside the window, the sky hanging low over Elliott Bay like it had something to hide. I had not slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red flash of that lock denying me entry. My phone showed 6 missed calls from Marcus. I ignored them. I opened my laptop at the small writing desk and logged into the company dashboard out of instinct more than strategy. For a split second, I braced for another denial message. But the system loaded normally. Revenue metrics, user engagement charts, client retention numbers. Everything steady. Everything alive. He had locked me out of our home. He had not locked me out of the infrastructure. A notification banner blinked across the top of my screen. Change of control filing. Pending final confirmation. Pending. Not completed. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Marcus might have moved fast, but he had not finished the job. I started this company when I was 27, sitting at a folding table in a 1-bedroom apartment in Tacoma. My aunt had lost most of her retirement savings to a charming financial advisor who treated her like she was invisible once the paperwork cleared. I built my fintech platform for women like her, women over 55 who deserved transparency instead of condescension. There was no venture capital, no flashy launch party, just spreadsheets, compliance filings, and years of convincing skeptical banks that I knew what I was doing. For the first 3 years, I paid my employees before I paid myself. For 6 years, I carried the anxiety alone. By the time Marcus entered my life, the hardest part was already done. We met at a regional finance conference. He was polished, articulate, confident without being loud. When we married 4 years later, he left his private equity position and joined my company as chief operating officer. It felt romantic at the time, 2 professionals building something together. He streamlined operations, cut unnecessary costs, negotiated better vendor contracts. The board liked him. Our investors liked him. Sometimes I mistook their approval for alignment. He used phrases like family legacy and long-term positioning. I talked about user trust and mission. We both said the word growth, but we meant different things. You've done the building, he told me once over dinner. Let me handle the scaling. At the time, it sounded like support. Now, sitting in that hotel room, I realized it had been a transfer of narrative. I opened the acquisition summary he had attached to his email the night before. I studied the numbers again carefully. The sale price was significantly lower than our last internal valuation, nearly 30% below the projections we had reviewed 6 months earlier. That did not make sense. Our platform had just crossed a major user milestone. Client retention was up. Regulatory audits were clean. We were positioned for expansion, not discount liquidation. I pulled up the internal valuation models and compared the data line by line. 2 weeks ago, growth assumptions had been revised downward. Subtly. Not enough to raise alarms in isolation, but enough to justify a reduced multiple during negotiations. The edits were made under Marcus's login credentials. My stomach tightened, but my mind sharpened. 3 years ago, something similar had unsettled me. He had proposed reallocating operational reserves into a short-term private investment vehicle. He called it capital optimization. The explanation felt rehearsed. Too smooth. That was when I scheduled a private meeting with an attorney recommended by a mentor I trusted. I remembered sitting in that downtown Seattle conference room, listening carefully as the attorney explained the structure of a founder trust, a mechanism that would hold my controlling shares separately from marital assets, a structure that required my explicit authorization for any transfer of ownership. Marcus had resisted at first. "Isn't that a little dramatic?" he had asked. "It's protection," I told him, "not punishment." Eventually, he agreed. I think he believed it was symbolic, a gesture to ease my nerves. It was not symbolic. It was binding. I returned to the present and stared at the acquisition summary again. My name did not appear anywhere on the signing authority line. Not as founder. Not as trustee. Only Marcus's signature appeared, listed beneath the title Acting Executive Trustee. Acting. I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not anger, but certainty. If he had signed without written delegation from the trust, the transaction was not secure. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Eleanor Hale. "You should have supported your husband. A family business requires loyalty." Family business. My company had existed long before I ever met her son. I did not respond. Instead, I logged into our shared banking dashboard. A transfer from Hale Family Holdings had cleared the previous afternoon. Categorized as Strategic Advisory Capital. Advisory for what? I closed my laptop slowly. Marcus believed removing me from the Penthouse would disorient me. He thought humiliation would weaken my judgment. Instead, it clarified everything. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped on the name of the attorney who had drafted the trust. 3 years ago, he had told me quietly, "Control is not what you announce. It is what you preserve." I pressed call. This time, I was not calling as a wife. I was calling as founder and sole trustee. By 9 the next morning, I was sitting across from Daniel Whitaker in his downtown Seattle office, watching rain slide down the glass like the city was trying to blur itself out. He didn't waste time. "There was an emergency board meeting last night," he said, sliding a printed document across the table. "Recorded at 11:42. 11:42. That was the exact minute the concierge told me my access had been revoked. I looked down at the meeting minutes. My name appeared under attendees as absent. No explanation. No formal notice attached. "I was never notified," I said. Daniel nodded. "There's no record of notice sent to your verified address." They cited urgency. Urgency. I scanned the resolution. The board had approved proceeding with the acquisition agreement and authorized the acting executive trustee to finalize all necessary documents. Acting executive trustee. Marcus. Daniel turned his monitor slightly so I could see the Washington Secretary of State filings. An amended board roster had been uploaded just hours before the meeting. 2 new names appeared. Gregory Vance, corporate attorney affiliated with Hale Family Holdings. Thomas Reed, Marcus's college friend. Minor investor. My independent board member, Linda Chavez, who had served since year 3, was listed as rotated out during strategic restructuring. Strategic restructuring. I repeated quietly. I remembered Thanksgiving dinner last year. Gregory Vance had stood at the Hale dining table with a glass of red wine, smiling politely as he asked me whether I planned to eventually integrate into a broader family platform. I had laughed it off at the time. Now his name sat on my board. Daniel tapped the bylaws section attached to the minutes. They inserted a temporary clause granting executive authority in cases of founder unavailability. Unavailability. I said, "I was at an investor dinner." He gave me a look that said the word didn't matter. I read further. The resolution stated that I had voluntarily stepped back from daily operational decisions due to founder fatigue, and that I had expressed openness to acquisition opportunities. A sharp, humorless laugh slipped out of me. 2 weeks ago, Marcus and I had argued in our kitchen about valuation floors. I refused to consider any offer below our projected multiple. "You're too emotional about this," he had said. "It's just a business decision." Now he was documenting me as unstable leadership. Daniel slid another sheet across the desk. A valuation memo attached to the board packet. I read it carefully. Revenue projections adjusted downward. Growth rates softened. Risk exposure emphasized. These numbers are conservative to the point of distortion, I said. They're defensible on paper, Daniel replied, but combined with lack of trustee authorization, they create exposure. Exposure. I leaned back in the chair, steadying my breath. Where did the transaction fees come from? I asked. Daniel clicked into another document trail. Hale Family Holdings funded a portion of the advisory and legal retainers. Of course they did. This wasn't just Marcus improvising. This was infrastructure. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Marcus. We need to talk. You're escalating this unnecessarily. I turned the phone face down. Daniel opened the signature page of the acquisition agreement. Marcus Hale, acting executive trustee of the Founder Trust. He signed in that capacity, Daniel said evenly. But the trust agreement requires written delegation for any change of control event. I never delegated, I said. I know. For a moment. I drifted back 3 years. The conference room had smelled faintly of leather and printer ink. Marcus sat beside me, charming and relaxed, as Daniel explained the structure of the Founder Trust. When the topic of co-trustee authority came up, Marcus suggested adding shared execution rights for simplicity. I declined. It complicates things. I said back then, this isn't about convenience. He squeezed my hand under the table and smiled. It's your company, he said. Now I understood something he hadn't. It still was. Daniel's voice brought me back to the present. If the buyer relied on a representation of trustee authority that wasn't valid, they face potential misrepresentation risk. And Marcus? I asked. He faces personal liability exposure. Silence settled between us. Daniel reached for his phone. I'm going to contact the Acquiring Funds Council and request confirmation of their due diligence on trustee authorization. I nodded. Within minutes. He was on speaker with their general counsel. Polite greetings. Careful language. When Daniel mentioned the Founder Trust and absence of written delegation, the tone on the other end shifted. I was not aware of a separate trustee consent requirement. The fund's attorney said, That's precisely the issue. Daniel replied. There was a pause long enough to feel like gravity. We will need to review this immediately. The fund's attorney said, An emergency meeting may be necessary. After the call ended, Daniel looked at me. They're scheduling something for tomorrow afternoon. Bellevue headquarters. A confrontation. I stood and walked to the window. The city below looked indifferent. Cars moved. People crossed streets. The world didn't know my marriage was collapsing inside a boardroom. My phone lit up again. Marcus. This time I answered. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. His voice controlled but tight. You signed without trustee authorization, I replied calmly. I had board approval. You didn't have mine. Silence. He exhaled slowly. We'll discuss this tomorrow. He hung up first. I slipped my phone back into my bag and turned to Daniel. He thought he outmaneuvered me in a boardroom, I said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod. Tomorrow, he said. We'll see whether he outmaneuvered the law. For the first time since the red light blinked against my thumb, I felt the shift. The deal wasn't done. It was fragile. And tomorrow, I would be in the room. Daniel called before I could even finish my second cup of coffee. I've reviewed the trust again, he said without preamble. There's no ambiguity. No change of control transaction is valid without your written consent as sole trustee. I stood by the hotel window, watching ferries move across Elliott Bay like nothing in the world had shifted overnight. And if he represented that he had that authority, I asked, then we're looking at potential misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty. The words didn't scare me. They clarified the battlefield. Did the buyer know about the trust structure? Daniel asked. I don't think so, I said. Marcus always called it symbolic. There was a pause on the line. Symbolic doesn't hold up in court, Daniel replied. After we hung up, I opened the secure digital vault where the founder trust documents were stored. The file hadn't been accessed in months. My name appeared on the first page as sole trustee and beneficiary. I scrolled to Article 7, Change of Control Requirements. The language was precise. No merger, acquisition, asset sale, or equity transfer. Exceeding controlling interest would be valid without written authorization executed personally by the sole trustee. Not by the board. Not by an acting executive. By me. My eyes moved further down the document until they reached the clause I had almost removed years ago. Executive spousal conduct provision. It sounded clinical. Harmless. It wasn't. The clause stated that if any spouse serving in an executive role engaged in concealment of material financial information, self-dealing, or breach of fiduciary responsibility in acquisition negotiations, trustee authority would automatically supersede all board authorizations, and the trustee retained unilateral power to void or suspend the transaction. I closed my eyes briefly. 3 years earlier, I had sat across from Daniel in a polished conference room while Marcus scrolled through his phone, half listening. At the time, I had just discovered irregular transfers between operational reserves and a private investment vehicle Marcus managed quietly on the side. "It's temporary," he had said. Strategic timing. The explanation felt rehearsed. Daniel had leaned forward and said gently, "If your spouse holds executive authority, you need a fiduciary safeguard." I remember hesitating. Adding that clause felt like admitting doubt in my marriage. Marcus had smiled when I told him about it later. "You don't really think I'd ever act against you," he said. "I think structures protect everyone," I answered. He kissed my forehead and called me cautious. Now caution was the only thing standing between me and erasure. I reopened the acquisition summary and pulled up the internal valuation report side by side. 6 months ago, our projected EBITDA multiple supported a significantly higher valuation. Growth curves were steady. Retention metrics were strong. 2 weeks ago, the projections had shifted. I opened the version history on the forecasting spreadsheet. The downward adjustments were subtle. Risk exposure slightly inflated. Expansion assumptions softened. All under Marcus's login credentials. My pulse quickened. But my thoughts stayed orderly. If those revised projections were used in negotiations, and if he failed to disclose prior higher valuations to the buyer or to me as trustee, that was material concealment. I called Daniel again. "There were downward revisions made 2 weeks ago," I said. "Only under Marcus's credentials. That strengthens the fiduciary breach argument," he replied, "especially if those numbers influenced the sale price. Can we confirm whether the buyer knew about the prior valuation? I'll request their due diligence packet." Within an hour, Daniel called back. "There's another layer," he said carefully. "The acquiring fund isn't entirely independent." My grip tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "A minority capital partner tied to the purchasing entity is Hale Family Holdings." For a moment, the room felt smaller. "So Eleanor indirectly benefits?" I said, "Yes. And there's more?" We located a draft consulting agreement between Marcus and an affiliate entity, contingent upon transaction completion. Contingent, meaning if the sale closed, Marcus would receive advisory compensation from a Hale-affiliated structure. This was not about scaling the company. This was about absorbing it. If that consulting agreement wasn't disclosed during negotiation, Daniel continued, "We're looking at undisclosed related party benefit." I let out a slow breath. Marcus hadn't just sold my startup. He had attempted to fold it into his family's financial ecosystem at a discount, while positioning himself for personal compensation on the other side. "I want to issue formal notice," I said. "Of trustee non-consent?" Daniel asked. "Yes. And reference the fiduciary breach clause." There was no hesitation in my voice. Daniel drafted the notice of trustee non-consent within the hour. The language was precise. It asserted that no binding change of control transaction could proceed without my written authorization and reserved rights under the executive spousal conduct provision pending review of potential material concealment. He sent it directly to the acquiring fund's general counsel. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Marcus. I answered this time. What did you send? He asked, his composure thinner than before. A clarification. I replied. You signed without trustee authorization. The board approved it. The trust did not. Silence stretched between us. You're overreacting, he said finally. This is procedural. No, I said calmly. It's structural. He exhaled sharply. You're jeopardizing everything. I'm protecting it. Another silence. You think this clause actually matters? He asked, a note of disbelief creeping in. It matters, I said. Because you never had the signature. Within minutes, Daniel texted me. Emergency meeting requested. Bellevue headquarters. Tomorrow afternoon. The deal wasn't secure anymore. It was under scrutiny. And for the first time since I stood outside that locked penthouse door, I felt the shift tilt fully in my favor. Marcus believed he had executed the perfect plan. He forgot the one document he dismissed years ago. And I was about to use it. The glass tower in downtown Bellevue reflected the gray sky like a polished blade. I walked through the lobby beside Daniel, my heels echoing softly against stone floors. I chose a navy dress that said restraint, not revenge. The receptionist looked up when I gave my name, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition. Maybe tension. Marcus was already inside the conference room when we entered. He stood near the far end of the long table, jacket buttoned, posture straight. For a second, our eyes met. No smile. No apology. Just calculation. At the head of the table sat the managing partner of the investment fund, flanked by internal counsel. Laptops open. Legal pads ready? Thank you for coming on short notice. The managing partner said, We need clarity on trustee authority. The air felt controlled but fragile. Daniel placed a printed copy of the founder trust agreement on the table and slid it forward. My client is the sole trustee of the controlling shares, he said evenly. The acquisition agreement was executed without her written authorization. The fund's general counsel flipped through the document, scanning Article 7. His expression changed subtly. He looked at Marcus. Did you possess written delegation of trustee authority at the time of signing? Marcus didn't hesitate. The board resolution granted me executive authority, he replied. We acted within corporate governance parameters. Corporate governance is not the same as trustee authority, Daniel said calmly. I remained silent, letting the words do their work. The counsel turned to the signature page of the acquisition agreement. Your title reads Acting Executive Trustee, he said to Marcus. That was based on board authorization. Marcus answered. Do you have written delegation from the sole trustee? Silence. Marcus's jaw tightened. We believed it was procedural. Procedural? The managing partner leaned back slightly. Hands folded. We conducted due diligence based on representations made by executive leadership, he said. If trustee authorization was absent, this transaction may be exposed. Exposed. I finally spoke. There's more, I said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were internal valuation reports from 6 months earlier and the revised projections used in the acquisition memo. Our internal projections supported a higher multiple, I said evenly. 2 weeks ago. Those projections were adjusted downward. The managing partner glanced at the documents. These revisions were made under whose authority? He asked. Marcus's credentials, I replied. Marcus turned toward me sharply. Those adjustments were conservative modeling, responsible leadership. Were prior projections disclosed during negotiation? Daniel asked. The fund's counsel flipped through their file. We were provided the revised models, not the prior ones. Daniel pressed. A pause. Not to my knowledge. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. The managing partner's voice cooled. Were there any related party interests connected to this transaction? Marcus answered quickly. No. I met his eyes. There is a minority capital partner tied to Hale Family Holdings, I said. and a draft consulting agreement contingent on transaction completion. The managing partner's head turned slowly toward Marcus. That was preliminary, Marcus said, the first crack in his composure visible. Exploratory. Was it disclosed? The counsel asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. The door opened behind us. Eleanor Hale entered with measured grace. Her coat draped over one arm. She offered the room a polite smile. "I thought it would be helpful if I were present," she said. "This is, after all, a family business matter. Family business." I felt heat rise in my chest but kept my voice steady. "It is a governed entity with fiduciary obligations," I corrected. Eleanor took a seat beside Marcus. "Our intention," she said calmly, "was to ensure disciplined ownership and long-term growth. Emotions can cloud strategic decisions." The implication was clear. The managing partner raised a hand slightly. "This is not about emotion," he said. "This is about legal exposure." He turned back to Daniel. "If trustee authorization is required and was not obtained, we must suspend the transaction immediately pending review." Marcus leaned forward. "Suspending now would damage shareholder value. Proceeding without valid authority could damage this firm." The managing partner replied. Silence settled heavily across the table. After a moment, the counsel spoke again. "Effective immediately. We are placing this acquisition on hold pending verification of trustee consent and review of potential non-disclosure." On hold. The word echoed louder than any accusation. Marcus's shoulders stiffened. "You're overreacting," he said. "This can be resolved." "It will be resolved," the managing partner said evenly. "But not today." The meeting adjourned with quiet efficiency. Documents gathered. Laptops closed. In the hallway outside the conference room, Marcus caught my arm lightly. "You're humiliating me," he said under his breath. "You locked me out of my home," I replied. "This was for our future. You signed without my authority." His expression shifted, anger layered with something closer to fear. "You think that clause actually matters?" he asked. "It matters because it exists," I said. "And because I never gave you the signature?" He released my arm. "You're forcing this into war," he said. "No," I answered calmly. "You did that when you tried to erase me." Outside, the air was crisp and sharp. Daniel walked beside me toward the parking garage. "They've suspended the deal," he said quietly. "But if we formally invoke the fiduciary breach clause, it voids it entirely." "Do it," I said without hesitation. Marcus believed the worst thing he could do to me was lock me out of our penthouse. He had no idea I was about to lock him out of the very deal he risked everything to close. By the time I reached my car in the Bellevue garage, Marcus had already sent a company-wide email. I read it in the driver's seat before starting the engine. Due to temporary procedural clarification regarding trustee documentation, the acquisition timeline is being adjusted. Leadership remains confident in strategic direction. Procedural clarification. He was reframing a governance crisis as paperwork. Within minutes, messages began appearing from senior managers. Polite, careful, concerned. "Is everything stable? Should we reassure clients?" I responded with one sentence. "Operations continue as normal. Governance review is underway." By the time I drove back across the bridge into Seattle, my phone vibrated again. This time it was not Marcus. It was a formal notification from a family law firm in downtown Seattle. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Filed in King County Superior Court. I sat at a red light and read the summary. Irreconcilable differences. Request for equitable division of marital assets. Explicit reference to shared growth equity in the fintech enterprise. Shared. He had moved quickly. Within hours of the acquisition being suspended, he was positioning himself for half of what he could no longer sell outright. Washington was a community property state. On the surface, that favored him. When I reached Daniel's office, he was already reviewing the filing. "He's arguing that appreciation during marriage constitutes marital property," Daniel said. "He'll claim operational leadership contributed materially to growth. And the trust. I asked. Predates marital commingling of controlling shares, he replied. But he'll argue intent. Intent. As if protecting what I built before he entered my life was an act of hostility. My phone rang again. Eleanor. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. You're destroying Marcus's future over pride, she said. I'm protecting my company, I replied. You married into this family, she continued. You could have been part of something larger. Instead, you're fracturing it. I built something before I ever met your son, I said evenly. She sighed softly. Marcus structured this acquisition carefully. You were meant to benefit. Olivia was meant to benefit. The family was meant to benefit. Olivia. So that was it. This was planned, I said quietly. It was strategic, she corrected. And you assumed I had no structural control left. There was a pause. You always were sentimental, she said. She ended the call before I could respond. Back in Daniel's conference room, we reviewed the evidence again. Downward valuation adjustments. Hale Family Holdings minority capital connection. Draft consulting agreement contingent on sale completion. It's enough to trigger the executive spousal conduct provision, Daniel said. Material concealment tied to personal benefit. Then we trigger it, I said. He drafted the notice of fiduciary breach that afternoon. The language was direct. It cited concealment of valuation data, undisclosed related party interests, and unauthorized trustee representation. It invoked the clause that automatically suspended Marcus's executive authority pending investigation. We sent it simultaneously to the board and to the acquiring fund. By evening, the board convened an emergency session. I joined by video conference. Gregory Vance attempted to argue that the clause was retaliatory, that I was weaponizing governance to punish a marital dispute. This is not a marital dispute, Daniel said firmly. It is a fiduciary breach review. Linda Chavez, the independent board member who had been quietly sidelined, spoke next. If trustee authorization was absent and related party benefit undisclosed, we face liability exposure, she said. This requires immediate action. Marcus's face appeared on screen. Controlled but pale. This is unnecessary escalation, he said. The acquisition benefits shareholders, not if it was negotiated under altered projections, I replied calmly. A vote was called. Temporary suspension of Marcus's executive authority pending fiduciary review. The motion passed. For the first time in our marriage, he was not leading the room. He was defending himself. Minutes after the meeting ended, the investment fund sent formal written notice. The acquisition was suspended indefinitely pending governance stabilization. They reserved the right to seek damages personally if misrepresentation was confirmed. My phone rang again that night. Marcus, I answered. You've destroyed my standing, he said. His composure finally cracked. Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation in private equity? You destroyed it when you signed without authority, I said. I did it for us. You did it without me. Silence. Then anger. You'll regret this, he said. In divorce court, I'm entitled to half. You're entitled to what the law says you're entitled to, I replied. He hung up. I stood alone in the hotel room. The city lights flickering beyond the window. The penthouse had been symbolic. Locking me out had been theater. The real objective had been permanent control of my company. He believed removing me physically would weaken me strategically. Instead, it forced me to see clearly. Late that night, Daniel forwarded confirmation from the investment fund. Transaction suspended. Fiduciary investigation pending. Marcus believed he had erased me from everything. Instead, he had triggered an inquiry that could erase him from his own career. The divorce petition was filed within 48 hours of the acquisition being suspended. I read it at Daniel's conference table, my name printed in bold above the words Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. Marcus requested equitable division of marital assets, including what he described as shared growth equity in the fintech enterprise. Shared. He had never sat at the folding table in my first apartment, calculating payroll by hand. He had never refinanced his own home to keep engineers paid. But now he wanted the word shared attached to my life's work. Washington was a community property state. On paper, appreciation during marriage could be subject to division. But the controlling shares were held inside the founder trust. Separate legal property, established before marital commingling. Daniel adjusted his glasses and looked at me. He'll argue that the trust was created in anticipation of divorce, he said. That it was strategic shielding. It was, I replied quietly. But not for divorce. It had been shielding against instability. I didn't say that out loud. Discovery began almost immediately. Subpoenas issued. Emails requested. Internal board communications preserved. Financial projections archived. Weeks passed in measured tension. Every document produced peeled back another layer. There were email threads between Marcus and Hale Family Holdings months before he ever mentioned acquisition strategy to me. There were drafts of consulting agreements contingent on transaction completion. There were messages referencing valuation flexibility. Premeditation. Daniel placed a compliance memo on the table one afternoon. The investment fund had conducted an internal review. The memo expressed concern about potential non-disclosure of related party benefits tied to executive leadership. Marcus had not only risked my company, he had risked the fund's reputation. The first court hearing was procedural. King County Superior Court. Neutral walls. Controlled lighting. No emotion allowed to spill beyond what the record could hold. Marcus stood at the opposite table, flanked by his attorney. He looked polished. But there was something brittle in the way he held his shoulders. His attorney argued that freezing him out of operations damaged shareholder value, and that my invocation of trustee authority was retaliatory. Daniel stood calmly and presented the trust agreement. He explained the executive spousal conduct provision. He outlined the downward valuation adjustments and the undisclosed consulting draft. When Marcus took the stand briefly for preliminary questioning, he maintained composure. I believed I had authority under board resolution, he said. The judge leaned forward slightly. Did you possess written delegation from the sole trustee? No, Marcus admitted. But I believed it was procedural. Procedural. The same word. The judge's expression did not change. Fiduciary duty requires explicit compliance, she said evenly. Not assumption. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I refused to react when Marcus's attorney suggested that I had become emotionally unstable during negotiations. Emotionally unstable. The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes before issuing temporary orders. I retained trustee authority. Marcus was barred from executing further corporate agreements pending fiduciary review. Financial distributions tied to the potential acquisition were frozen until asset classification was resolved. Not victory. Leverage. Outside the courthouse, rain fell lightly against the steps. Marcus avoided my eyes as we exited. Within days, word traveled quietly through Seattle's investment circles. Executive recruiters withdrew interest. Advisory boards distanced themselves. The acquisition fund reserved its rights to pursue damages if misrepresentation was formally established. Olivia sent me a message late one night. You ruined his career. I stared at the words for a long time before deleting them. Eleanor did not call again. Silence can be strategic. The evidentiary hearing focused on the fiduciary breach itself. Altered projections. Related party capital connections. Draft consulting compensation. Under questioning, Marcus admitted he had anticipated the trust would not interfere. You assumed, the judge repeated. Yes, he said quietly. The courtroom felt very still. I realized in that moment that Marcus had never truly believed I would challenge him publicly. He believed marriage meant compliance. He believed removing me from the penthouse meant removing me from leverage. He underestimated governance. The judge announced she would issue a written opinion addressing both fiduciary breach and asset classification in the divorce. Days later, we stood again in that same courtroom. Her written ruling was clear. The equity held inside the founder trust remained separate property. The attempted acquisition lacked valid trustee authorization. Evidence supported a finding of fiduciary breach sufficient to justify suspension of executive authority. Marcus's claim to half the company was denied. The acquisition agreement was deemed unenforceable absent trustee consent. Outside, the rain had stopped. Marcus walked past me without speaking. For the first time since the red light flashed against my thumb outside the penthouse door, I felt something that wasn't anger or strategy. It was closure. He once believed locking me out meant he controlled the ending. He was about to learn that control belongs to the one who understands the rules and never surrenders their signature. The judge's written ruling arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. I read it alone at the long conference table in my office. Sunlight cutting across the polished surface in thin gold lines. Each page turned slowly under my fingers. The equity held inside the founder trust remained separate property. The attempted acquisition lacked valid trustee authorization. Evidence supported fiduciary breach sufficient to justify suspension of executive authority. Marcus's claim to half the company was denied. I set the papers down and let the silence settle. There was no cheering, no dramatic relief. Just the steady realization that the ground beneath me was solid again. Later that afternoon, the investment fund sent formal notice terminating the acquisition agreement. Their language was measured but firm. They reserved all rights related to potential misrepresentation exposure but would not proceed without valid trustee consent. The deal was over. Completely. Marcus did not call. Within days, the consequences began moving quietly through the financial community. Executive recruiters stopped returning his inquiries. Advisory board invitations were withdrawn. The compliance review note from the acquisition attempt followed him like a watermark. No headlines. No scandal splashed across news feeds. Just reputation erosion, the kind that doesn't make noise but closes doors permanently. Hale Family Holdings released a short statement distancing themselves from operational decisions. Eleanor's name did not appear in any further correspondence. Silence can be self-preservation. 2 weeks after the ruling, I walked back into our company headquarters for the first time since the lockout. The lobby felt the same. The glass walls, the muted hum of servers, the faint scent of coffee from the break room. But the atmosphere shifted when employees saw me step through the doors. Relief is quiet but unmistakable. I called an all-hands meeting that afternoon. No mention of Marcus. No recounting of legal battles. I stood at the front of the conference room and spoke about governance. Transparency. The responsibility we carried toward the women who trusted us with their retirement savings. Our mission doesn't change because leadership does, I said. It strengthens. I announced restructuring. An experienced female CEO in her early 60s, with decades managing pension funds, would step into operational leadership. Independent oversight would expand. Compliance reporting would become more robust. Applause filled the room, not loud, not explosive, but steady. They weren't clapping for revenge. They were clapping for stability. A few days later, I returned to the penthouse one final time. It was staged for sale. The furniture rearranged. The art replaced with neutral pieces meant to appeal to buyers who didn't know its history. I walked to the window overlooking Elliott Bay. The city looked the same as the night I stood locked out in bare feet. But I was not the same woman. Marcus believed locking me out would destabilize me. He believed removing my access would erase my authority. What he didn't understand was that ownership isn't defined by proximity. It's defined by structure. The penthouse had been a symbol, a reward, a shared illusion. The company was the legacy. I ran my hand lightly along the window frame, then stepped back. There was nothing left for me here. I deleted Marcus's contact information that evening. No dramatic gesture. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some chapters close without reconciliation. Revenge, I learned, isn't always loud. It isn't public humiliation or explosive confrontation. Sometimes revenge is restraint. Sometimes it's understanding the rules better than the person trying to rewrite them. Sometimes it's preserving one signature that no one else can claim. In the weeks that followed, I received emails from clients, Women in their late 50s and 60s who had followed the acquisition rumors and felt unsettled. They thanked us for maintaining independence, for not selling out quietly. They didn't know the full story. They didn't need to. What mattered was that the platform remained steady, transparent, uncompromised. Marcus thought he erased me with a contract. He believed a board vote and a locked door meant the deal was done. But he forgot something fundamental. The only signature that ever truly transferred power was mine. If you've ever been made to feel erased from something you built, whether it was a business, a home, or even your own story, remember this. Authority isn't given away by someone else's confidence. It's protected by the structures you choose long before you need them. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand your ground quietly while someone underestimated you, I'd love to hear it. Share your experience in the comments. Tell me what you protected and how you did it. Stay with this channel if you believe intelligence wins over chaos. If you value stories about betrayal, hidden power, and justice that doesn't need to shout, there are more stories like this. And sometimes, the strongest revenge is simply refusing to disappear.